Hey there, everyone. I'm just wanting to, frankly, I'm studying for my English final tomorrow morning at 10. So, I was getting bored. So I decided to do something stupid. And you guys can laugh at me all you want. It'll be entertainment for you and studying for me. I am now going to sing my Colonial American Literature notes for your enjoyment. Well, here goes. And yes, if you're wondering why I'm reaching forward to touch the screen every so often, that is where my notes are. So, lovely touch screen. Here we go. Okay. A long, long time ago. Nope, that's already been done. Well, here's a description of the colonial American hero. He faces death and uncharted territory every day of his life. The environment is his enemy, and later that becomes the Indians and basically anybody different. But that comes later. So this guy named John Smith is considered an early American hero. He wrote the history of Virginia, which is the stupidest thing. Well, I shouldn't say stupid. It's the most proud, prideful, exaggerative, and highly imaginative account of history I've ever read. So he's considered an example of an American hero, but listen to this. He's not self-effacing. He exaggerates everything. He's always facing death. But he escapes with his wit and popularity with the women. In case you can't tell, I don't like this guy. And he talks about himself in the third person. And he's an entrepreneur that lives in Jamestown. He wants to sell land to the poor people back home who can't own their own. He says, come down to Jamestown, own land and property, create your own things, get your own food, and you'll see you'll get all you want to eat, beginning to have self-sufficiency. Sell your unique skills to the members of your community. Yeah. And he writes in epic style with flowery language and structure. Basically, I don't like him. So let's move on. Now, all of this time, I had thought that colonialism and the Renaissance were two different periods in the same world. But it turns out they're one and the same. 16th, 17th century. That was totally new to me. So here we go. Social influences that led to new freedom of thought. The Protestant Reformation, the printing press, the rising middle class, development of art in Italy. Italy's always ahead. Security of the monarchy is stabilized because there's no major wars going on. Just you wait for 1776, you British. And because of all this security, both socially and financially, the exploration and discovery of America was possible. And one more note, colonial lit in general was strictly utilitarian. And by that, I mean, it was written in plain English, the language of survival, practical, it always has an agenda. Because if you don't have a reason for writing, why waste your precious time trying to survive the harsh territory that breeds the development of American heroes? Now here we go to someone who's not British. Don't know why we're studying him in British Lit. His name's Bartolome de las Casas, and he wrote The Devastation of the Indies, which is undoubtedly the most depressing thing I've ever read. He's early modern Europe's most eloquent advocate for Native American rights. You go, man. He was a student in Seville in 1493 when Christopher Columbus made his triumphant entry with 7 Taino Indians. And although he later called the seizure of those Indians the first injustice committed in the Indies, very creative, when he went to Hispaniola, he eagerly participated in the exploitation of those same natives. But after becoming a priest, he was convinced that such behavior was unchristian. So he took the case to Spain in 1515 and became the protector of the Indians, with permission to found a peaceful colony in Venezuela. Oh, Venezuela! It was to be an example to the world. But in order to make this work, he proposed that black slaves be shipped to the Americas rather than the Native Americans. Until he realized, wait a minute, that's just as bad. All slavery's wrong. Are you kidding me? So he ditched that whole idea, and thus the venture failed. So he withdrew into seclusion at Hispaniola for several years. But of course, he couldn't just leave those poor Indians all alone. So he returned to the political arena in the 1530s, and with wild success. For in 1337, Pope Paul II forbade further enslavements, and in 1542, Emperor Charles V forbade Indian enslavement in his new laws of the Indies. So as Bishop of Chiapas, Mexico, Bartolome de las Casas tried to enforce those laws. But of course, those selfish Spanish caused riots and mayhem. So much for a peaceful colony. And Charles V had to revoke his ruling. There goes that. So he returned to Spain and spent the last years of his life writing the most graphic depiction of torture and cruelty ever that I've read. There's probably been worse that I've been written, but I haven't read them. That I've ever read. And he was accused of heresy because other Protestant nations used his critical writings as fodder against Catholic Spain. Pity. He was trying to be good, you know. He was actually hoping that Spain would reform, but instead his writings were used against him and his country. Moving on. Alvar Nunes Cabeza de Vaca. Yes, his last name means head of a cow. You want to know how he got that name? His ancestor on his mother's side led a victory against the Moors by marking a strategic route through the mountains with a skull of a cow. And thus, as his reward, he was granted the name Cabeza de Vaca. What a reward! So, on to Alvar Nuez. So, Mr. Cabeza de Vaca fought in the wars in Italy as a young man, and in 1527 he joined Panfilo de Narvaez's disastrous expedition to Florida. Now, you see, Narvaez wasn't a good leader. 600 of his men deserted at Hispaniola, and he lost 2 ships in a hurricane near Cuba. And in a moment of utter stupidity, he sent all his remaining ships in search of a port, and the ships never returned. So they suffered through threatening Indians, eating their own horses, and then Narvaez took the best oarsmen and deserted the rest of his men, never seen again. The rest of the men got on handmade barges and wrecked on the coast of Texas, and spent 2 years as Indian slaves and prisoners, before gradually moving west and gaining respect and status among the natives as a merchant and a healer. Now that is specifically Alvar Inez Cabeza de la Vaca, or Cabeza de Vaca. Anyway, so that guy and his friends, Andres Dorantes, and Dorantes' black slave, Estevanico, and Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, they're the only survivors of this several thousand men expedition that went drastically wrong. So as they're going along, and he's writing down his experiences, he encounters Spanish slave hunter Diego de Alcatraz on the way to Mexico. But instead of being rescued, he's arrested, and the natives who are following him are made into slaves. Now, who thinks that's fair? Come on. So, he sought to protest the treatment of American Indians and set up a colony with an enlightened ideal. But his own colonists overthrew him and sent him back to Spain in chains. And he was exiled to Algeria. And it was in Algeria that he wrote this memoir. And it shows the culture of the Indians with which he traveled and was imprisoned. It gives a lot of detail and is actually quite fascinating. And a little bit less depressing. Well, no. I mean, the fact that they all got captured for trusting the head of the cow, that just kind of is a little bit sad. Anyway, moving on. Now we get to the one everyone knows, William Bradford, who survived Plymouth snows. He was a weaver and a farmer before he became a Puritan. Well, specifically, a Scrooby separatist. He is interesting, for he participated in the history which he wrote. He was 19, my age, when he left home to join the separatists in the Netherlands, and he was in his 30s when he arrived and became governor of Plymouth Plantation. When he was writing his history of Plymouth Plantation, his audience were the people back home and future posterity, for he knew he weren't the last, there'd be people coming after, so he'd need to write down everything. And because Puritans valued education, he was literate, and everyone kept journals quite well. And now for a brief word on colonial history. Number 1, it was written in plain style. Number 2, straightforward. Number 3, it's an elevated language. I don't know, maybe they wanted to seem more educated than they actually were. Number 4, it's detailed. Very detailed. Not totally detailed, but like, well, he documented what they ate for the first few days, which is fascinating for sure, especially for historians, but, you know, it's not exactly like novel material. Number 5, it's personable. Number 6, it's didactic. And for those of you who don't know what didactic means, it means it's got a moral lesson to it. Which brings me to point number 7, it's moral. You wouldn't think of history nowadays as having a moral to it. But in this case, all colonial history, number 8, always has an agenda for writing. So in this case, let's see what his perspective was. The perspective of me as governor of Plymouth is that God is leading and destroying our enemies. For as you notice, every sailor who is ever cruel to us has gotten what he deserved, and those savage Indians will not get away with their heathen ways for long. Moving on, Mary Rowlandson, one of 24 lucky survivors of a brutal Indian attack. And she wrote her own creative captivity narrative. Did I say creative? Like I'm saying, I'm totally improvising this whole thing in case you can't already tell. So, sorry about the whole creative thing. It actually happened to her, so no need of creativity. Just write down your own life. Anyway, one of the most interesting things I noticed is that she received a Bible from an Indian. How would the Indians even know that she would want something like that? She used it many times, and it provided her with encouragement from above. Which was good because so many bad things happened to her. She had to watch her youngest child die in her arms just a few days after capture. And she was separated from her other son and daughter, both of whom she later saw again. Just a spoiler alert. Her master was kind, but the wife to whom she belonged was not. She was beaten and cast out in the cold, and brutally abused and starved. So she often found food and shelter from her master's other squaws, and also from Indians whom she'd never seen before. And she even got to see her son a few times while both were still held captive. To me, she seems like the luckiest Indian captive ever. And all along the way, she was surprised that God would spare her Indian captors from the English army and starvation. So listen to this. This is her logic, coming from a very Puritan background. She decided that God spared the heathens to be a scourge to his people. She used to want troubles to come to her, to show that God loved her, because he loves those he just loves. So when this trial came, she was glad and decided to be cheery, because her trial was a punishment for her sins and an affirmation of God's love to her. Now that's twisted. I guess in those days they didn't have any concept of the devil, so they thought God made everything bad happen and everything good. Anyway, she was ransomed by her husband for 20 pounds along with many other items demanded by the Indians, and later got to be reunited with her son and daughter and her husband, and they lived happily ever after. The end. Now we go on to Puritan poets. Martin Wigglesworth, undoubtedly one of the most famous of his time, but frankly, this was the first I've heard of him. He kept a diary in his early life. Its entries focus on the day of judgment. He considered bad things to be a sign of God's wrath and soon coming judgment, including the burning of 8 houses in Boston. I wonder, was one of them Aunt Bradstreet's house? Anyway, that's just speculation. So, his father died, and he was rather upset, not because of the death, but because he felt ambiguous towards the death of his father, and feared that was a sign of future evil on his part. He wrote The Day of Doom 9 years later, and it quickly became a hit among the Puritans, for reasons you shall soon see. But Martin Wigglesworth was a nervous, anxious, self-doubting man, never physically strong, but some of his illnesses were likely imagined. He entered Harvard College at the age of 16, wow, intending to become a physician. His introspective, bookish manner meant, instead of being a doctor, he had to become a minister. The good old days, when your personality was the only thing that determined your career path. So he ministered at Malden, Massachusetts for 50 years, and was pretty much not popular with the people until he published The Day of Doom. How ironic. As an uninspiring preacher, he wrote to try and make up for his lack of charisma in the pulpit. And attitudes toward him were softened only when he showed himself willing to jeopardize his reputation by marrying an unbaptized servant much younger than himself. Where's the logic in that? I mean, seriously. You would think they would have been rather upset at that. Anyway. Now, The Day of Doom had hymn-like stanzas and written in heroic verse. In other words, iambic pentameter. And those verses contain complete thoughts, strict meter, and strict rhyme. Is part of the oral tradition memorized by Puritans. Can you believe they memorized this whole 2,000 stanza or 200 stanza poem and repeated it often? And it's about doomsday. It's basically a Bible study on the Last Judgment, complete with Bible texts in the margins. Not added by the editor. It's got a didactic purpose. Again, that means teaching. Its purpose is to reform, to bring to God, to teach the judgment doctrine. The soul must prepare, not just understand and believe. He must seize the day, carpe diem, and prepare and repent before it's too late. Biblical allusions are very, 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 very thick, almost as thick as Paradise Lost and Dr. Faustus and John Donne's metaphysical poems. Anyway, the Puritans memorized the Bible and learned by hearing those who couldn't read. And so that was why they memorized this poem of doom, which was both persuasive and informative. Now on we get to Anne Bradstreet, one of my favorite, my favorite author of this time period. Her father was the manager of the country estate of the Puritan Earl of Lincoln. She received an education superior to that of most women at the time. She married Simon Bradstreet when she was just 60, and a year after their marriage, their husband was appointed to assist the Massachusetts Bay Company, and her family traveled to America, and she was at first resistant, the New World in all its barbaric ways, but soon she submitted to the will of God and joined the church at Boston. She had rheumatic fever as a child and was never very strong, yet she risked childbirth 8 times. That is one brave woman. Her husband was the governor of the Bay Colony and was often away from home. She doubted that the miracles in the Bible were real, but was convinced by witnessing God's hand in nature. She wrote poems when she was young to please her father. She's the author of many poems, and her first set was published without her permission into the book The 10th Muse. So that inspires this poem called The Author to Her Book, which I actually find somewhat humorous and also somewhat sad. It's basically a response to the book of her poems that her brother-in-law John Woodbridge and her friends took to London and published without her permission. Where were copyright laws in those days? She likens the book to ragged, rambling, hobbling brat. That's harsh. It's hobbling because it has imperfect metric feet. And it's rambling because she hadn't edited and had time to trim her words. She was upset by her friends' rash action, but understood their good intentions. All the same, I can assure you, her second edition was heavily edited. I think her poems are just fine. To my dear and loving husband, she writes a Song of Solomon in the modern age. Well, modern back then. It's a celebration of love that makes other women jealous and wish that they had men as lovely as hers. There's mentions of gold and wealth and riches, showing that love is more valuable than jewels. Now if only couples nowadays were as madly in love as they, we wouldn't have so much divorce or one-night stands, 'cause that ain't love, let me tell you. And later she writes poems to her husband away on business perpetually. Surprising that they still loved each other so madly, even though he was like never home. And in these poems she likens herself to a hind, in other words a female deer, a turtle dove, and a mullet, which is a kind of fish. These are all creatures that long intensely for their mates. And in this dramatic, poetic language of Petrarchan love, she beseeches him to come home. And now my personal favorite, upon the burning of our house. And no, I don't enjoy the despair of others, but I like this just so much because she's so content. And she also shows her human side. She's not perfect, but she trusts in God. It's written in the heat of the moment on a loose piece of paper. She lost everything. And this leads to a perspective shift. All worldly possessions are foolish and worthless. You should look for heavenly things. Now, as a review for, this is like my college final, I just gotta add this in here. A note about the past. This is part of the elegiac tradition of Where Are They Now? Otherwise known as Ubi Sunt, for those of you English majors who might be listening. On to Edward Taylor, which I actually don't have to know for the test, but I thought I'd just throw him in there, because I like his poem Upon a Wasp Chilled with Cold, which we didn't even have to read for class. I mean, seriously. I read that in junior high and in junior English in high school. But we don't read it in college. We read Huswifery instead. Which is also just as good. But, you know, Upon a Wasp Chilled with Cold, you don't get much better than that. Anyway, he had a lifelong obsession with poetry. But it wasn't discovered until the 1930s. In the Yale University Library. He was heavily influenced by John Donne and George Herbert. And for those of you who don't know, they kind of founded the whole school of metaphysical poetry. And you probably still didn't go that, but probably went way over your heads. So I'm going to continue. In Huswifery, he likens life to spinning and weaving, and asks God to control him, to make his life pure, the pure wedding garment necessary for him to enter heaven. Now we get to Cotton Mather. You knew this was coming. He's the eldest son of, guess what? Increase Mather. Sorry. Increase and Cotton Mather. People really named their kids interesting names in the old days. He was notorious for his role in the Salem witch trials. That mass hysteria that has influenced our lives until this day. I mean, think of the Red Scare. Think of Japanese internment camps. Think of all the Middle Eastern terrorist scares we have today. We call them witch hunts, and this is why. Because a witch hunt is something you must know from history. Yes. Well, all that information about Cotton Mather that I have down here I probably don't need to know for the test, so I'm going to continue on to what a witch hunt is. So Cotton Mather wrote the wonders of the invisible world. Each pointed out his point of view, that the Americas were the devil's territory. They blame anything bad that happens not on devil, but on God, punishing the town for someone's disobedience. So let me go on to the causes of a witch hunt, so you guys can see why today we have them. I mean, some of the causes are the same, some are different, but they all involve fear and mass hysteria and the build-up of many bad things over time happening at once. And the belief that bad things are God's punishment for wrongdoing. Now that isn't necessarily true today, but you know, the bad things and the fear and the hysteria are. So just think about all the different, like, hatreds we have of a certain race or group of people or belief system or politicians. Yeah, you get it. Moving on to the characteristics of a witch hunt. There's always mass hysteria involved, and they had spectral evidence that can only be seen by a few repentant witches. Now, why would you trust the word of a confessed witch over people who are maintaining their innocence? Well, here's why. Because in a witch hunt, the accusation is the only evidence that's needed to convict you. There's no way to defend yourself. It's hopeless. Might as well give up now and recant your beliefs that you don't hold, and you'll be spared. Anybody ever read The Crucible? I did. We didn't have to read it for class, but I read it like years ago and loved it. But it also made me scream and cry because it was so unfair. Going on. Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening. Sinners in the hands of an angry God, you are not safe from his wrath. That's basically the whole theme of this several-hour-long sermon, delivered in monotone, staring at the back of the church at the rope bell till people wondered if it would fall off. Now that is creepy. So the theology is there's no halfway to salvation, no compromise. God despises sin but is merciful in that he doesn't automatically destroy everyone but gives them a chance to repent. When I first read this in high school, I thought, oh my goodness, they must not believe in a loving God. But when I reread it, I see these little tidbits tucked in between that indicate that in their own strange way, they believe that a wrathful God was also a merciful God. Which I agree, but I don't agree with everything they say. Because God does not hold us over pits like spiders. I think he likes us a little bit more than that. But the most important imagery of that entire sermon, which I really need to know for the test, is the image of God holding us like a detestable spider over the pit of hell. Well, thank you for likening me to a spider. He believes in Calvinist theology, the acronym known as TULIP. And for those of you who've never heard of it, I will now disclose its meaning. First of all, Calvinists believe in the total depravity of man, then the unlimited sovereignty of the power of God, then limited atonement, which means Christ's sacrifice only applies to the saved believers who are predestined to be saved, and the irresistible grace of God's offering you must accept, and then perseverance of the saints. Those saints will remain strong and pure till the end. Good for them. I hope to be among that number. And one final thing. Besides the classical cultures, which I just gotta pop in here really quick because I need to know that for the test as well. Puritans and Pilgrims are pretty much the same thing, but there's two different sects living in different places. The Puritans are in Boston, the Pilgrims are in other places in Massachusetts, Plymouth, and all of them. And there's the Spanish in the South, and the Indians everywhere, and the Southern entrepreneurs in Virginia. And all of these cultures are clashing in what's going to become the great melting pot. Now, I'm going to get to the final thing. The moment you've all been waiting for, the final conclusion, the full quarter author overview of Survey of British and American Literature. Here we go. The Venerable Bede wrote Caedmon's hymn. No one knows who wrote the Dream of the Rood and the Wife's Lament. The Wanderer or Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or any of the York plays of the Crucifixion. And the Second Shepherd's Play, and Every Man are also both mysteries. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, and Christopher Marlowe wrote Dr. Faustus and the Passionate Shepherd to his love. That's weird. Sir Walter Raleigh wrote the Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd, and Sir Thomas Wyatt wrote Whoso to Hunt. And Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, wrote the Petrarch and Rimas, and William Shakespeare wrote sonnets 18, 19, 29, 73, 116, 130, 138, and many, many more besides, and the Twelfth Night, which we also read. And Robert Herrick wrote Queen is Going A-Maying to the Virgins to Make Much of Time, and Andrew Marvell to His Coy Mistress, John Milton to Paralyzed Lost, John Donne wrote Batter My Heart and Song, and George Herbert wrote Love the Third, which is the most strange and unexplanatory title ever, and John Smith wrote the General History of Virginia, Bartolome de las Casas wrote the Gestation of the Indies, Alvar Nuez Cabeza de Vaca wrote the Revelation of Aguilar Nubes Cabeza de Vaca. William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation, Thomas Morton, New English Canaan, Mary Rowlandson, The Captivity Narrative, Martin Wigglesworth, The Day of Doom, Anne Bradstreet, My Dear and Loving Husband, the author to her book Upon the Burning of Our House, Edward Taylor, Housewifery, Cotton Mather, The Wonders of the Invisible World, Jonathan Edwards, The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, The Personal Narrative, and Ben Franklin, The Autobiography, which we never actually got to read. And that's that! Thank you all for listening to this most assuredly the most idiotic thing you've probably ever wasted an entire 40 minutes of your life watching. For those of you who made it to the end, I applaud you. And yeah, I may or may not upload this. I have not yet decided because right now I feel like an idiot, but I also feel very well prepared for the test tomorrow morning at 10. So, in 11 hours, actually, precisely, because it is after 11 right now. That's why I'm feeling kind of goofy. Not because I'm on drugs or anything like that. So those of you who are going to say, oh, she's high. I'm not. I don't do drugs. Learned that in elementary school. So, all that's left there is, then, that I am an English major, and I absolutely love English acting, and I'm a music minor, so I love singing. Combine it all together, and you've got this waste of 40 minutes of your life. So, good night, and sleep tight. Hopefully you're not staying up late watching YouTube videos. I know you. I know you out there. I've done the same, so yeah, in case you ever find yourself on the weird side of YouTube and you find yourself watching this, yeah, keep watching. Okay, I'm done.